Hello humans! Today I wanted to talk about this guy right here, which I recently ended up picking up at a trip to my local antique store. This is a Mora-made Erik Frost. So Erik Frost is one of the two companies that merged in 2005 to become Morikniv, which is one of the most popular budget knife and bushcrafting knife companies in the world. Massive sale numbers, make some of the greatest knives in the world in my opinion, and it's one of the two companies that merged to become this, KJ Erickson being the other. Which, a little bit of humorous history here, KJ Erickson, the guy who founded it, actually worked for Erik Frost in Erik Frost Cutlery Company back in the 1900s until about 1911, where he was fired. He started up his own knife making company, and then almost 100 years later they merged to become one of the absolute powerhouses of the knife making world, which is just kind of cool. Erik Frost has an extremely long history as a knife company. I did a whole separate video on that, a year ago now, I think. And all the information in that video is still good, is still valid. It's just super cool company. But as a result, whenever I see an Erik Frost, I do try to pick it up nowadays because I do think that they are really cool and they have an incredibly cool history. And a lot of them are still being made. So this is a Frost number 2. It's one of the first models that the Erik Frost company made. Erik Frost started off his career making sleds for and felling tools for the lumber industry, and he made the knives out of little cut-off pieces of that steel. And there have been laminate steels since basically the company started in the 1890s. So super long history of making knives out of Erik Frost's workshop. And some of the models are still in all essence around. So here are a few things that you can see still even on modern knives. First and foremost, the red birch handle. When some of the earlier examples and the more expensive examples of Erik Frost's knives, you have curly birch or very strongly patterned birch with a laminate over top of it. This particular example is one, and this isn't, well, I don't know for sure that this is an Erik Frost, but I know for sure that this is a Swedish-made knife from in and around the same time period. And as you can see, beautiful curly birch with a laminate handle. Absolutely adore this knife. But lesser birch and less expensive models where they didn't have such beautiful patterning to them, what they did instead is they stained them. And then later on, instead of just staining them, what they ended up doing was staining and painting them. So this is one of the examples that was both stained and painted. You can see where there is no paint, there is in fact stain. And in other areas, there's the much deeper coloration of a proper paint, which is kind of interesting. It puts us in sort of a transitional period between the different methods. And for a multitude of reasons, including that, I believe that this is made somewhere in between the 1930s and the 1950s. And the reason why is because of this defect on the back. Right there, you can actually see a delamination fault occurring. The reason why this suggests that it is from between sort of the early 30s into the late 50s, somewhere in that area, is because of the methods of production that were occurring. Until the early-ish 1930s, the laminate material was made by hand-forged laminate material for all of the Erik Frost blades. And what that ended up meaning is that there was a much higher QC process involved, and small faults like this were very easily noticed and removed from production. However, in the 1930s, they started making their own laminate on site using massive spring hammers and stamping the steel blades out. And what that ended up translating to is a slight dip in quality during that time period. In the late 1950s, they started phasing out these spring hammers and started importing laminate blades again. So at that time period, it started phasing out. But as a result, this type of delamination fault, and as you can see, it is actually very, very evident that it's occurring in a straight line across where that lamination occurs, isn't something, and I'm not saying it's impossible that it predates that, because it is technically possible that it just fell through QC through the hand forging, but it is significantly less likely that that is what ended up happening. That, coupled with the two-tone handles, makes me fairly confident that this is an example from between the early 30s to the late 50s. That is not precise enough, however. And here's where I need to get into a little bit of conjecture, unfortunately. If this is the original sheath, and that's where like a lot of the big bit of conjecture here is going to occur, because I cannot confirm that this is the original sheath. Like I said, I picked this up in an antique store. I have no idea what has happened in the 70 to 90 years between this being produced and me getting my hands on it, unfortunately. But operating under the assumption that this is in fact the original sheath, which it very well could be, this was a model of sheath that was used for the number 2, so it is more than possible, then that would put it towards the end of the range, the late 50s into the 60s, when they finally started making these plastic sheaths. And it is quite a nice sheath. So again, just totally nerding out over how cool Erik Frost is as a company. They made a whole bunch of design patents in the early 1910s, 1920s, even into the 1930s and 40s on how their sheaths were going to be made. And one of the earlier adaptations that they did is they designed this sort of belt style attachment that led to the blade always being along the side of your body. Now, this differs from other knife makers at the time, where you would see things like dangler loops, which are pretty good and do a decent job of keeping it, although it still does allow for a fair amount of twisting. And in other instances, you would find drop loops or even sheaths that weren't necessarily designed to keep it sort of flat edge of the blade against your body. So that was an early advancement that the Erik Frost company made. Another very, very cool one is the sheath has like none of the cool attachments, but some of the earlier sheaths that were leather, what they did is this loop would have gone all the way over, and you actually put the blade in, and your belt attachment has a cap to it, and you put the cap over the knife, and they patented that as well. And then they had internal latches to hold the knife in there a little bit better. They even ended up using this super cool cardboard laminate material, and they still use it in some things as sort of a fake leather. Super, super cool history, and unfortunately, because late 1950s into the 1960s, they started using some plastic sheaths alongside the other options. Retention's good. I mean, it works perfectly well as a sheath, but it is kind of the most boring of the Erik Frost sheaths, unfortunately enough. Anyway, the number 2 and in fact the whole red handle line are some of the things that ended up surviving the merger and are still produced today. So some of the ways that we do know that this is a historical example, for one thing, obviously, the stamping changed with time into, let's see if it'll do it there. Into the 70s and 80s, we start getting this totally different design of the Frost's cutlery logo. And that is one sign that this is older. Another sign that we get that it is older is the imperfections of the paint, and like you can actually see how off that the handle is ever so slightly offset. There's a lot of hand tooled elements to this knife, which are just part of what you get with things that were made 70 plus years ago. All told, the knife is in fairly good shape. It does have a slight bend towards the tip, but other than that, no components of it are rocking. It's still very, very well put together. This is obviously not the most pristine museum quality piece, but for somebody who does intend to use this, and I do intend to use it, this is a nice, suitable knife. It is exactly that, a nice, suitable example of this knife, and it does round out my number 3 of the collection. So let's get real quick into some sizing. Here it is next to some of its newer brothers, the Mora Garberg and the Morikniv Companion F. Another interesting thing, I just keep getting sidetracked by the interesting things. I could ramble on forever about some of the cooler bits of Erik Frost, but Erik Frost did left-hand stamping and right-hand stamping on a lot of their models and sold both. As you can see, this later example is right-hand stamped, very similarly to the modern Moriknivs, but both this number 2 and this Scout model are actually stamped for left-handed use, which is different. You don't see it as much anymore, but you did used to see it significantly more. As you can see, it is almost exactly the same size as the Companion F. The Companion F has a slightly longer handle, but in the blade they are pretty much identical, and it has a ever so slightly longer blade than the Garberg, which is just kind of the way that it is. Very, very neutral handle, slightly oval shaped, means that indexing feels very good. It is very easy to find where your edge is on this knife. And yeah, another cool thing about Erik Frost, I keep getting sidetracked. I'm gonna get sidetracked forever. I love this thing. But Erik Frost is actually one of the people who started with this Scandinavian grind, Scandi grind, where, and obviously this example has been resharpened significantly over the years, but the initial bevel goes all the way out to the final edge, which leads to a lower angle on your final cutting bevel, despite the fact that the grind doesn't go as high, which leads to more toughness. It's something a lot of bushcrafters really, really like today, and it does make a lot of slicing tasks much easier. It also makes sharpening a lot easier, which is why examples like this are very interesting to me, because typically sharpening with a Scandi grind, you can literally just lay that primary bevel on your stone and run it from there. So the fact that somebody gave it a different edge after the fact is quite curious. Yeah, super, super cool knife. I'm extremely happy to have this in my collection, and you can still find treasure at antique stores. I know a lot of antique stores out there are struggling nowadays, but if you are a hobbyist, if you are an enthusiast, online sources are not always the best bet when you are looking for good deals and interesting things. And a lot of local antique stores are going to have a significantly easier time buying cool stuff and therefore being able to sell it back to you. So I'm not trying to say never go online and look for stuff. I do it all the time. It is at times worth doing, but local antique stores have had many of my best winners over the last several years. So yeah, just cool thing, a nice knife. I'm very, very happy to add this to my collection, and stay safe and have fun out there. Peace.